Hey, P5 students, it's Mr. Kid here. Got a quick video for you. We're talking about summarizing. That's your next skill for reading comprehension. So, pay attention for the next few minutes while we talk about what summarizing is all about. Now, you probably have done this before, right? In the writing, you were asked to do some things when it involves writing at the conclusion of the writing of these articles that you've been doing. And summarizing is also a necessary reading comprehension skill. Why? Because it trains our brain to pay attention to the main points, the main parts of a chapter, a paragraph, an excerpt, a book, a movie. We pay attention to the main events. And when we summarize, we retell that story by just pointing out the main events. So let's do a little bit of practice with this, and then I'm going to teach you a simple way to remember how to do a summary. And then probably coming up soon, when you get a chance to write a summary, it's going to be all the more easy to be able to do it on your own. Okay, so here we go. Let's get into it. All right, so here we are. I have a Google Doc opened up for you, and I have this little picture I want to show you first. Summary. Right, so I have these keywords here, these letters here that I want you to remember. SWBST, 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 whatever helps you to remember these letters. These are very important when it comes to writing any summary, especially in a fiction story. This becomes very important, okay? So, somebody wanted, but, so, then, and that's it. We want to use these key words to be able to identify key information in a summary. Who is the main character? What does the main character want? What is the problem? How does the character try to solve the problem? How does the story end? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use this pattern, these key 5 words, and we're going to use it to build up a summary based off of something from a Roald Dahl book. And you are so lucky, I've invited Mr. Stringer to read a part of one of our Roald Dahl books that we are focusing on this year, and it is from the Twits. So pay attention, enjoy, and we'll come back when Mr. Stringer's finished, all right?
The Wormy Spaghetti from the Twits by Roald Dahl. Narrated by Mr. Stringer. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It is not as good as the ordinary kind, he said, talking with his mouth full. It's too squishy. I find it very tasty, Mrs. Twits said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. I find it rather bitter, Mr. Twit said. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, You know why your spaghetti was squishy? Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. Why? He said. And why it had a nasty bitter taste? Why? He said. Because it was worms, cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter.
All right, welcome back. So Mr. Stringer has just done a wonderful job reading this part from the Twits, and now we need to identify and put a summary of it together. So, like I just said before, somebody wanted, but so then. So we need to try our best to retell what Mr. Stringer had just told us, but we only need to pick out the important parts, right? And so this is what we're going to use to help us find the important parts. So down here on this document, I have the story that Mr. Stringer just read. So let's try to highlight the certain bits that answer these questions. So first of all, the one is somebody. And the somebody is who is the main character, right? And so that one's pretty easy. So let me get our highlighter tool. All right, so somebody. So the next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. So somebody in this case would be Mrs. Twit, right? Indeed. Okay, so let's highlight her right there. And wanted. So this one was a little bit tricky, but if I go back here, what does the main character want? And this is interesting because she wants to do something to Mr. Twit, right? And why does she want to do something? She wants to pay him back for the frog trick. And if you'd read this story before, you would know that earlier, before this, Mr. Twit had played a mean trick on Mrs. Twit with a frog. So now it was Mrs. Twit's turn to pay him back. So actually, right here, that answers our what. Okay, so I could even make it simpler. I don't even need to use the frog trick. So the next day, to pay Mr. Twit back, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden. All right, but shows us our problem that she has, and the problem is in this case is quite similar to the main purpose that she has, right, of what she wanted. So Mrs. Twit, in fact, let's do this down here in this little table. Let's just fill it out really quick. So Mrs. Twit, she wanted to pay back Mr. Twit. Okay, but so I guess what we can do here is we can think of, she had to think of something clever, right? She had to, well, now we need to think about what she really wanted to do. So she had to do something clever. So to pay him back, she dug up some worms, right? So her problem was Mr. Twit. So she dug up some worms and turned them into, what was it that she did? She turned them into spaghetti. Ugh, gross. Then, what happened at the end? All right, so what's the solution? So we have this great part here where Mrs. Twit very cleverly made a pasta for herself that looked similar to the pasta Mr. Twit had, but Mr. Twit ended up eating what? Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful because it was worms, right? So Mr. Twit ate all of the worms. Okay? So right here, we now can have a good idea of what this whole story was about, right? Mrs. Twit wanted to pay back Mr. Twit, but Mr. Twit played a trick on her. So she dug up some worms and turned them into spaghetti. Then Mr. Twit ate all of the worms. Simple as that, my friends. Okay, so these keywords right here are really helpful in helping us identify the important parts of a passage or a book. So I want you to try it. Here's my challenge for you. I'm sure in this time that you've had off, you've watched a movie or you have read a book or many books, so you've probably watched many movies. Try to use this little bit right here and try to use those keywords. Try to use these keywords to come up with a summary that you can share about what you've read or watched. All right, so at the end of this video, that's your challenge. Go ahead and try it out. You could even type it out, or you could do it with a family member, something to help you practice that. Okay? All right. And we will be posting a little bit more information as we go on further in the week. But now you have a general idea. We are looking at SWBST. Somebody wanted, but so then. All right?